So this afternoon we're kicking off with another debate. Politicians should have nothing to do with education policy. I'm Joanna Williams, I'm Head of Education and Culture at Policy Exchange, and with me to discuss this motion this afternoon, rather than it being a bloodbath and pitching in against each other, we're going to tease out some of the complications of mixing education and policy and where we should draw the line between the realm of the school, the realm of the teacher, the realm of the policymaker, the realm of the politician. But expert, absolutely expert panel to discuss this with us today. On my left, I have the Right Honourable David Laws, currently Executive Chairman of the Education Policy Institute since 2015. Prior to this, David served in the coalition government as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Schools Minister and Cabinet Office Minister. I hope that's correct. And as Schools Minister, you were responsible for numerous initiatives, but perhaps most notably Pupil Premium. And on my right, I have delighted to have Sir Mike Tomlinson. I've been practicing saying Sir Mike Tomlinson without adding the word review on the end of it, because whenever I say the word Tomlinson, the word review always seems to want to follow automatically. Sir Mike was chair of the government's working group to reform curriculum and qualifications for 14 to 19-year-olds, proposals which were published in 2004, but I think are still very, very much worth reading today and carry lots of important lessons for education now. Before this, Sir Michael spent 13 years in teaching before becoming Chief Inspector and Head of Ofsted. Currently a school governor, a member of the livery of the Merchant Tailors Company, and a trustee of the Baker Deering Trust, responsible for the establishment of university technical colleges. So we're in very safe hands, very expert hands for this afternoon's topic. What we're going to do, we're going to have David speaking for 6-7 minutes, followed by Michael for the same amount of time. A little bit of interaction between the two of us, some points of disagreement before going out to you. So do get your questions, your comments ready. So, David.
Joe, thanks very much. When I was a politician, I think there was probably no more popular thing that you could say at an education conference than that there should be less political involvement in education. Even more enthusiastic were people on that point than the need for extra finance in education. But I'm going to start today with the sort of case for the defence. Why do we have to have some politics in education policy? Then I'm going to highlight, I think, some of the areas where there are problems as a consequence of how the political process rubs up against education policy. And then I'm going to finish by suggesting a few possible solutions. But starting with the case for the defence, we put, as do most developed countries, a huge amount of our national income into education. Governments make those choices. I think inevitably governments are the only organisations that can decide how much of taxpayers' money and the national income to spend on education. I don't think you can contract out that element of policy making. And as soon as you've got governments on behalf of taxpayers deciding to spend 5-6% of national income on a public service, they're going to expect, and the public will expect, a degree of oversight and accountability for the broad way in which that money is spent. So I think it will be very difficult to envisage politicians of some type not wanting to be involved in the process of identifying what the curriculum or the core curriculum looks like. And I think that inevitably politicians will have some sense of what good system performance, good value for money looks like, and they will want to monitor those factors. And it's not obvious that you could contract those things out to other organisations or individuals without a democratic mandate. I think also we shouldn't lose, in terms of the English debate about politics and education policy, the point that England, compared with many other countries, has quite a high degree of autonomy in schools, and certainly for school leaders. It may not feel like that for school leaders a lot of the time because of the accountability system, which I'll go on to touch on, but autonomy is pretty high compared with other systems, particularly in the developing world, where often schools and head teachers, and sometimes education departments, don't even control their own manpower, but those may be employed by another part of government. And finally, in terms of the case for the defence of government, government hasn't taken or kept all of these powers over policy to itself. It relatively recently contracted out a lot of the decision-making about what works in the classroom to organisations like the Education Endowment Foundation to do a lot of high quality research about impact, which I think was a very good thing to do. And there are, in theory, independent, or maybe I should say quasi-independent organisations like Ofqual as qualification regulator and Ofsted that also do some of the things that government in other countries takes on for itself. And that's generally a good thing, I think, that inspection of schools, school judgments, and the regulation of the exam system is done separate from politics. So it's not true that we have a system where politicians decide everything. But politicians have a pretty big impact, not least for the reasons I've just given. And I think that there are some problems with that. One which, the first one which I would flag, and which I was more conscious of after my time in the education department, is the extent to which government and government departments are designed around implementation rather than research and evaluation and informing themselves of what the evidence looks like in terms of the drivers of good policy. Politicians generally come to power having put together a manifesto which they then feel obliged to implement. The amount of research that's gone into the policies in that manifesto is, in my experience, quite variable and sometimes has little to do with the evidence base. And departments and civil servants aren't encouraged to think of themselves as generators of policy evidence, given that ministers come to them with prefixed ideas. And ministers often don't have an incentive to commission rigorous evaluations of their policies because they can fund the policies anyway from the taxpayer coffers, and finding out that some of their policies aren't working and having that publicised in the newspapers isn't what politicians are generally excited about. Secondly, because of the pressure for political delivery, the high turnover of ministers, which I guess we're about to see more of in the near future, there is a tendency to have not only a lack of evidence base for a lot that's going on in education, but change that is extremely rapid. One of the big complaints by the profession. Often there are overlapping changes in curriculum, qualifications, and accountability systems before we even know what the results of the previous system were. And that means that we don't learn from what we've done in the past. And also these people charged with delivering education policies in the classroom often have a higher workload and less capacity to be effective because of the rate of change. There's also, in my view, too much interference in the detail sometimes of what's taught, how it's taught, and of qualification structure. I remember during my time in the education department, arguments with Michael Gove about the precise detail of the history curriculum, whether Mrs. Thatcher should be part of it, or whether she should be excluded from it. The eventual compromise being that she was essentially the end of history rather than a specific subject. I remember Nick Clegg phoning me up one lunchtime to tell me he'd just met a delegation of people who were angry about Mary Seacole's removal from the history curriculum and telling me embarrassedly that he'd promised that she would go back in as a specific item, and now I was charged with sorting that out with Michael Gove. And I think that the detail of a curriculum and how you sensibly teach different areas of a curriculum over time is something actually that politicians are very ill-equipped to deal with. And having a sort of outsourced, stronger function developing the curriculum and how a curriculum or subject should be taught, I think would be very helpful. We also at times have had weak regulation. I talked about Ofsted and Ofqual earlier on, but that's not to say we can take it for granted. And you could get periods of time where politicians are sort of conspiring with the system to make it look like the system is improving more rapidly or deteriorating more rapidly than it actually is, in order to get political credit potentially from changes or demonstrating the system's not working. And also we have the fact that the although we have a very large degree of autonomy in England, we have a very high stakes accountability system. And that accountability system often drives unintended effects in schools, which aren't always benign in terms of their outputs. So very briefly, respecting my 1 minute to go, what are the answers to this? They are, firstly, I think, a much stronger evaluation and research function, either in government, in terms of a default being that all major policies should be subject to research and evaluation, or probably, given that governments are going to be unwilling to do that as much as we would like, a stronger function outside government that can hold government to account and help government with the policy decisions, because often it's not that they want to do stupid things, it's that they don't know what a better policy solution would look like. Secondly, I do wonder whether in terms of curriculum design and qualification design, we could do more to strengthen the capacity to do that outside government, providing advice that ministers would probably have oversight of. And linked to that, I think that we ought to think about whether we can institutionalize much clearer rules that would regulate the pace at which changes in accountability, qualifications and curriculum took place at. And finally, I think that there is a case for thinking about how we regulate the unintended consequences of the accountability system. I think Ofsted and Ofqual are now trying to do some of that themselves, trying to lean against the problems that they themselves may be involved in. But whether we need a more formal function to do that, given the big impacts of the accountability system on English education, I think is an interesting question. So yes, politics creates lots of problems in terms of education policy. No, we're never going to get rid of political influence. The question is, can we do considerably better than we're doing now?
Thank you, David. Sir Michael.
Thank you. And can I say good afternoon to everyone? I'm going to come at it to begin with from a slightly different perspective. I'm not a historian, but I want to look at it from a historical perspective, the involvement of politicians in education. And just by way of background, as HMI and subsequently with Ofsted, indeed beyond retirement, I have worked with every Secretary of State since Sir Keith Joseph, apart from the present one. The last one I worked with in length was Nicky Morgan. So I've worked with a few of them, and they're ministers at times. I won't go into the question of what were they all like, so please don't ask me that question. I start from the act which defined the system, which probably all of us at some stage or another have been involved with. That was the 1944 Education Act. And I note then it was very broad in scope. And it was a tripartite system that was proposed. It was never fully implemented as a tripartite system. And it saw education, in quotes, a national system locally delivered. The only curriculum requirements in that act were to teach religious education, then defined quite different from now. And of course, students should have physical education. That was the sum total of requirements then placed on schools. What that resulted in, quite naturally, was that local education authorities had full responsibility for all the schools within their boundaries. So at that point, what I want to stress is there were politicians still involved, but there were local politicians, not national politicians. So even at that point, you had politicians involved. And I have to say, having inspected a number of local authorities and so on, some were benign in their behaviour towards that responsibility. Others were ideologically driven, not only in what they wanted taught, but actually the materials and so on that might be used. Since the late 80s, there's been a marked shift. The watershed in effect, in terms of acts, was the 1988 Education Reform Act, which changed the education scene completely. But it had also crept in before that. And this was a time when Sir Keith Joseph was very concerned about initial teacher training. In particular, he was concerned because he felt there was far too much time spent in the higher education institution, and he was very suspicious of what was being taught, particularly when it came to his view that sociology was there and all the rest of it. He was not having any of that. And he wanted to have more say in that area of delivery with the universities. He tried to put a bill through Parliament and failed, and swore at the time that he'd never introduce a bill into the House again. But he was helped by legal advice to find a route into doing it, which within the 44 Act, somehow or other, the legal advice was, you do have the power to accredit teacher training courses. He thought, that's my thing. So he then introduced the idea that to be accredited to the universities, you must invite HMI in to inspect your teacher training. If you don't do so, fine, but you will not be accredited and you will not be given a tranche of students to educate. So he'd already poked his toe into the idea of central government being involved in the policy of that time of initial teacher training. Then I don't want to spend a lot of time on the Education Reform Act, except to say it introduced a lot of things which you'll be very familiar with. Local management of schools, national curriculum, national testing, and all the rest. Since that time, my calculations suggest there have been over 40 further acts of Parliament concerned with education. Given that there was none between 44 and 88, that's quite an explosion of activity by central politicians. And of course, that involvement of central politicians has covered early years, particularly during the Tony Blair government and the centre set and so on, through schools, through FE, and occasionally with HE. Of course, most recently in terms of fees and all the rest. There are many reasons for this change across the sectors. Some of it was the view that local education authorities were useless and failing in their duties. Others were pushed by wanting to see institutions more self-managing, because there was a lot of evidence elsewhere in the world that suggests that decisions made at the local level are better decisions than those made at another level. So my view is that I don't think we will ever get to a point where we do not have politicians involved in education. The question is, which of them, and what should be the balance between national and local? So what I would like to finish with really is, what should be their involvement? And further, what should they be doing which would give us a system which got over some of the weaknesses and difficulties now? Well, the first thing, and I hasten to add that this is my wish list, I've had wish lists before, and they've not been implemented, so I don't expect any of these to be implemented either. But here we go. I think there should be a 10-year cross-party plan for education. Actually, we've been very near that in the last 10 to 15 years, odd though it may seem. And that there would be, within that period, a fixed point for reviews. 3 years or 5 years. Nothing would change in those periods. Nothing would change. If somebody wanted to be changed, fine, they could log it, but it wouldn't be looked at and argued about until that period was up. And those reviews should involve personnel from all sectors and indeed from the community at large. There should be a certain degree of coming together about that matter. And I think that would give schools greater certainty for planning, and it would really bite into this continuous change. Not only year on year, it can be term on term. Secondly, the plan, I think, should be properly funded. And that funding should be worked out, not being that. What does it... The interesting question, what does it cost to run a school of size X, Y, and Z? And any subsequent changes from those reviews that require changes in schools would be funded in addition to whatever else was there, if necessary. And schools, I would wish to see, would be largely responsible for implementation of the detail of that plan and held to account quite properly, because it is public money, through regular monitoring, which could be done digitally without having people coming in and producing paper, and of course also inspection. Like David, I think we need to look very carefully at the various means of schools are held to accountable and ask ourselves, are they all necessary, and what can we do to cut them down? I think the government should be held to account annually for their role in the plan. That might sound radical, but there are 2 countries I've been invited to which do that. I'll just say, and those countries, if you want to look up, are Denmark and Sweden. In Denmark, annually, all ministers come to a meeting like this, and I was the first non-Danish person to address one of those annual seminars. All the ministers are there. The audience is a mixture of head teachers, teachers, parents, researchers, civil servants, a lot. And there are presentations about how has that bit of the policy in last year developed? What stopped it being effective? And if it was politicians, they're told, well, can you unblock that issue? And I think that was a revelation, to be in such a meeting and hear that exchange. It wasn't about blaming the politicians. It was constructively about, we agree with what you're doing, but we weren't able to do it because. Can we get rid of that difficulty, please? There'll be no micromanagement of programs by politicians or civil servants. My long experience says and this is the point where politicians think that by putting in an act of parliament, that what they want in that act will be implemented. It's slightly delusional. The fact is that what then they do is go back to default position of wanting through one means or another to micromanage it. My experience is they're less skilled at micromanagement, less effective micromanaging than almost any school is in terms of micromanaging what it's doing. I would like to see a national programme for schools in difficulties through an external agency, not to call them in the Ofsted terms, but schools are in and out of being in difficult situations, often necessarily not for reasons of their own making. I think we need a much more sympathetic approach to this. Certainly, when I led London Challenge, we didn't use that principle at all to improve London schools, and we improved them to go to the top of the regional tree rather than be at the bottom. So there are ways of doing it. There are ways of challenging. It's not a case of soft hand on them. It's got to be tough, but it's got to be done quite well. I would also like to see every person involved in education having an allocation of money that is in their name to be spent on their personal and professional development. And finally, connected with that, I think we have to look very carefully at how we can continue to train and retain the teachers we need in our system. It's partly about status, it's partly about other things. But unless we have good teachers, we can't have good education. And I think that would lead me to suggest that we ought also to have a systematic review of the organisation, staffing and operation of schools to ensure that they are efficient. And it strikes me, if you'd have come down into a school in the 1980s and today, you would not have found much difference in the way that learning is organised, i.e. the timetable. And I put the question, is the timetable really about organising teaching or facilitating learning? I know which it ought to be, but it's not what it is. So I think there are some interesting questions there. And lastly, I think we need a full review of governance of schools. I think the accretion of responsibilities, the accretion of the way it's got to operate over time means that many people are unwilling to be acting as governors, and we need them to act as governors. So my case is really, I don't think you can avoid politicians being involved, whether they're national or local. I would want them to be more strategic than operational and leave the operation and implementation at the school level. And what I would hope that would do is provide greater certainty and continuity for education, and not least for those many bodies which recruit directly from school or college. We haven't so far mentioned much about those who receive our young people at 18 or beyond, whether they are today and tomorrow, more importantly, ready to take their place in society. And I think we should have much more thought about that. If one primary school I was in recently, the speaker was talking about careers and simply said, I have to tell you all, the careers you will have don't exist today.
Thank you very much indeed. If I can just put one question myself, and then if you're sitting in the audience, get your questions ready because I'll be coming out to you. My question is just, what do both of you think should be the relationship between politicians, schools, teachers, and research, educational research? So I'm sure many people are aware that organisations such as Research Ed have taken off and become very popular in recent years. We have a much broader basis, much bigger knowledge about what works in education than ever before. And if we have this knowledge, if we have this base of research, and we have teachers who I think are far more research literate, to coin a phrase, than ever before, are far more familiar with working with educational research and interpreting and assessing the value of educational research. Does this lessen the role for politicians? Should it lessen the role for politicians? And I guess the sub-question to come from that is, can education change? Can schools change without the involvement of politicians, or must politicians be involved? David?
Yeah, I mean, I would separate it into, crudely, what happens in the classroom in terms of how do teachers and school leaders organize themselves to ensure pupil learning is as effective as possible. Most of that I would keep 100 million miles away from politicians so that they're not picking and choosing their favorite interventions, which often have no evidence base, or do have an evidence base and it's not the evidence base they're claiming. And having organizations like the Education Endowment Foundation try to do that work to then help people in schools to decide what's an effective way of using their resources and money is a much better way of doing it. And maybe you ought to encourage other organizations, and we certainly need to think about how we get the conclusions of that work that the EEF is doing through to people in schools, because at the moment I think there's a lot of great work being done, but if you go into a lot of schools in the country, they're completely unaware of it, and they'll say to you, what on the earth should I spend the pupil premium on, years and years after we've introduced the pupil premium. And then I would separate that type of education policy from national policy work, most of which will inevitably sit in the department. Not always, I agree with Mike, that the department does the implementation very well or should do it. But the big sort of national questions about what is the school improvement strategy, what different national policy solutions are likely to lead to better outcomes in schools, the government should be leading in those areas, and it should be looking at research about what works in this country and internationally, and it should be commissioning evaluations of its own work to see whether things are effective or not. And I remember having, at the end of my time in the DFE, a very evidence-based conversation about the topic of whether we had enough national leaders of education working in Eastern England to try to improve schools in that area. Why do we have so few NLEs? How do we deploy them into the weakest schools? Was there a problem with Ofsted ratings being too low in that area in disadvantaged schools so that we weren't getting enough? And at the end of this wonderful hour of evidence-based thinking about how to get more NLEs, my policy advisor, who was one of the most sort of bright and research-based people in the department, said to me, "Minister, you do realise that we've had this conversation for an hour without anybody raising the elephant in the room, which is that we have no evidence base indicating whether the government's policy of deploying national leaders of education has any impact on standards at all." And there is so much of that that happens. This is not just, I hope, during that government or in that department. Much that governments do, including in the Treasury, that often claims that they are the most evidence-based department, doesn't have an evidence base. And people don't really expect there to be an evidence base, and they don't expect their policies to be looked at and evaluated over time. And that's a huge problem. And it's very uncomfortable for ministers to have evaluations, pay for them, and then discover that their policies aren't working. But that is a huge gain if we can get closer to it as a country.
Michael, should politicians be deferring to the evidence more?
Yes, the problem, the problem for us in this is, first of all, often the research that's necessary takes longer than the period that the ministers are in office. And as a consequence, in my experience, the minister coming in to a takeover is not interested in what his or her predecessor did, because that's not going to get him any further up the pole. More importantly, I'll have my own agenda. So time is an issue there, and timing is an issue there. And David, I agree with Dave. Very often what comes forward is not welcome because it doesn't reinforce the policy proposition at that point in time. I do think the biggest challenge we've got, and David's alluded to it, is I think we have got a long way to go before we produce from research evidence the sort of discourse that can be readily used in schools to inform what they ought to be doing or could be doing. And that channel of communication, it has never been effectively developed. I think the Education Foundation has got a long way towards it, but I think it could do more because teachers' time is hugely under pressure. They don't want to receive a paper that needs hours of reading. They don't want a paper that is quite properly research written. They want to know what are the elements of that that will help me to think about what I might do differently, to do to do better by that group of, because very often the research is about particular groups of children rather than whole school entities. So I think it is a problem, but I do not discount the importance of research, but I would want to see much more of a really well thought through channel whereby that research can get to the teacher in the classroom and be helpful to their development personally and professionally.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, over to you. I can see a number of people want to speak. If we can start in the corner over here, please. Thank you.
Thank you. It's James Tooley, professor here at the University of Buckingham, a very new boy here. I particularly enjoyed both speeches. I enjoyed Mike's pitch for the Tomlinson Review 2. I thought that was very good. But I want to see if I can push David, or push a position that David is taking here. You were saying 5.6% of GDP implies the need for regulation spent on the sectors, therefore politicians inevitably will get involved. But what Mike showed us very clearly is really once politicians get involved, they can't stop being more and more involved, and that however much we want a minimal or a semi-minimal state in education, we are going to have the plethora of regulations that follow. Public choice theory tells us that, but I think it's almost inevitable. So can I push you to think a little bit of in the unthinkable way? We're at the University of Buckingham. Buckingham receives no state funding. Is it conceivable that we could have somewhere which doesn't get that 5.6%, that somehow reduces that amount and leads to an education system like Buckingham is a flagship in the higher education sector? Could we have that? I'm obviously inspired by my own work in low-cost private education, but I'll
Thank you.
stop there.
Can I be very horrible and ask you to keep your answers to an absolute minimum so we can fit in as many as possible? But I don't know if you've got a very quick response to that, David.
Yeah, I mean, part of my question about money is that somebody has to decide the quantum, and that's never going to be anybody other than politicians, and then there'll be an expectation. I don't accept that, nevertheless, that will lead to the same solutions in different countries. And I've already mentioned that in this country, we've got a number of independent or quasi-independent organisations, Ofqual, Ofsted, EEF, doing work that could easily sit in the DFE. And if you look at other countries in terms of qualification and curriculum design, my understanding is that in many of those countries, a lot more of it is done outside the political sphere than inside the department. So I think that there are different models. And as to whether the higher education sector is a good or bad example for, more freedom and accountability, I'd say that's an open question. I mean, we don't really know how much value for money HE is giving us, and there is quite a debate about whether or not government, in exchange for this quite large share of GDP that we're giving HE, is getting, and students, by the way, are getting value for money. So I don't think we know whether HE is a good or a bad example.
Would you be happy for me to go up for someone else?
Yes.
Yeah. There was a hand over here on this side of the room. No, they've changed their mind. Okay, let's go to, thank you.
Thank you. My name's Ian. My name's Ian Cocksalt. David, you talked about the sort of combination of high accountability and high autonomy, I think very compellingly, and I think we can see that leads to a degree of fossilization in models. And I think you both touched on sort of research as a sort of feedback route for assessing what can work better, and politicians for sort of being a channel for the regional and national aspirations of what should happen. Do you think there is a different sort of feedback route that can sort of begin to upset that fossilization and sort of prompt education organizations of all types to sort of move forward, without it necessarily having to be as centralized in the sort of political way that it has been?
Michael, do you want to respond to that?
Can I just ask the question, are you looking at sort of shifting some of all of the responsibility away from central government and politicians? It's always possible to do it. Whether one wants to do it or should do it is a different matter. I think my argument would be that the balance at the moment is with central politicians, very much so. The responsibilities at the local level have been reduced to an absolute minimum. And the autonomy of schools has added to that. I think for me the question is, what is the balance and what should be the role of politicians? And that's what I tried to pinpoint. I do think that there must be other models. There are other models around the world, of course, but there are nobody that I know around the world that I've been to where central government is not intimately involved. In some cases, so much so, for example, in some, that they know exactly at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday what you'll be teaching. We don't want to be there. In fact, that sounds to me like hell, and I'd want to get out of it quickly. So I think our system may not be perfect, but it's better than many that I've witnessed.
Thank you, David. Did you want to...
Yeah, I mean, two brief points. One is that part of the reason I think we've got this ultra accountability system in England is that all parties have spotted that we have this relatively unusual tale of underperformance, highly associated with social class. So a massive amount of the accountability system is to try to lift the bottom 40% up to scourge all the schools in which the results are bad and where more vulnerable students are. That, I think, does have a sort of fossilizing effect and a sort of skewing effect on a lot of what is going on in schools, including some schools that don't have that challenge of the bottom 40% of attainment. I think if we over time can narrow some of those gaps and move to a higher attaining system, governments will probably be willing to ease up a bit on the high accountability. The second point is that governments have focused a lot in the last 20 years on structural reform of education, academies, grammars, UTCs, and so forth. Most of the evidence is that most of those changes haven't made much difference, partly because beyond small initiatives like the original Sponsor Academy program, your ability to change the whole education system is bounded by, the average. It's bounded by who are your teachers and head teachers. You can't deploy all the brilliant ones to every school in the country. That means I think there's going to be more focus on trying to recruit, retain, and develop the workforce and focus on how you do that more effectively so that you can have system-wide impact. And politicians are peculiarly badly placed to find policy interventions that make individual teachers better. I mean, we thought about this quite a lot at the end of the coalition. Should we have a standard minimum hours of CPD? We couldn't find any evidence that a lot of CPD works. What other things would make teachers teach better? And I think the solutions in that space don't sit with central government, and largely central government acknowledges that. They sit much more with the profession. And I think that will lead to much more thought being given by government as to how to enable the profession to do more on professional development.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question. I'm really keen, if we've got it, to have a question on higher education. If not, don't worry. But just thinking about government policy in relation to higher education might be one way. Perhaps you could come back to that on your concluding comments. Let's go for the woman at the side over here, please.
Hi, I'm Ashley from Guildhall School of Music and Drama. There's been a significant reduction in the number of students taking part in music education in schools over the last decade, I think, but probably before that. And I just wondered if you thought that there's scope for better government policy around the breadth of an education and the importance of an arts education for young people as well as everything else.
Well, that's a great question. And as you kept it nice and concise, let's squeeze in one more question at the same time. Chap over here, please.
Hi, my name's Peter from University of Roehampton. I'm head of the School of Education Teacher Training. Just wondered to what extent it's the government's fault that nobody wants to be teachers. For example, in London, the last 6 years, 55% fewer 18-year-olds are doing undergraduate training courses to teach.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask you to make your concluding comments answering either of the two questions that have been posed, and also if you've got an answer to my question about the future of higher education and the Auger review, obviously we've had the extent to which government policy should be shaping higher education over the coming period. So these are your concluding comments now. If we take you first, Michael.
Well, the question about arts, yes, I entirely agree with you. Entirely agree. And that has happened because of the way in which the accountability system has been designed. I'm pleased to say, and I think she's still at the back there, the current Chief Inspector is changing that picture in the new framework, which will give much, much more emphasis to the broad educational experience that I think you are arguing for. So there is hope. Don't dismay. Don't leave the profession. You're wanted.
Thank you, Michael. Sorry.
Go on, yes.
No.
David wants to come in on that. I'll come in on the other one.
No, if you finish your concluding comments now, thank you.
I think it's easy to blame government for the issues about teacher recruitment and retention. I think it's a societal matter as well. When I started in school, teachers were considered always right, certainly by my parents. Furthermore, they could sign things like forms for this, that, and the other. Not least if you wanted to go abroad. Now, I think that what we've got to get is society to understand and really understand the enormously important and valuable role that teachers do. And when you say to parents, and I have in some cases, much to their annoyance, simply said, just think about it. You've got your 3-year-old, you adore, you love, you believe he or she is the best thing that's ever happened to them, and you walk down a pathway and you hand him over to a totally unknown individual and say, please educate them. If that's not a matter of trust, and it's also not a matter of why you should hold them in high esteem, in countries where there is no problem, that is half the answer, the esteem by which teachers are held within the public at large. It's also about salaries as well, I hasten to add a little bit. But it is that esteem, and I don't think that's a government fault necessarily. The government doesn't help itself, and in recent times, to not admit that there is a real crisis here, I find quite impossible to understand. Because we do have a crisis. We do really have a crisis.
Thank you very much. David?
Yeah, on the music question, I'm not sure whether we do have convincing evidence as to whether it is the accountability system, funding, or something else that's driving the changes. You might say he would say that because he helped design the accountability system. But actually, if you look at some of the trends in other parts of the UK in similar subject areas that haven't had the accountability changes, they've had some trends that look similar. But I do think it raises the interesting question that Mike touched upon as to whether we shouldn't be doing something, including through Ofsted, to ensure that the incentives driven, that the accountability system drives to focus on certain subjects are not the sort of only end objective for schools in delivering a curriculum. In other words, I think there is an issue of what a broad and balanced curriculum looks like, which may go beyond simply filling your Progress 8 and Attainment 8 buckets. And I think if Ofsted can do the difficult job of inspecting curriculum properly, it may be able to lean against some of the bad incentives that accountability systems can bring in. On attracting teachers, although it's tempting to think that quite a lot of it is about the reputation and prestige of teachers in different countries, the truth is that in most countries we recruit from the average part of the attainment distribution in terms of graduates. And when you look at what tends to be a driver of problems in our country at any point in time, it is relative pay changes. You know, if the public sector lags behind private, it is pay and shortage subjects, and it is high outside the classroom workload versus most other countries. And I think those are the main reasons why we go through periods of struggling to recruit. It's simply the case that at times in England it doesn't look like an attractive profession, particularly for starting teachers versus other areas. I'm so sorry, David. And I think we've run out of time on HE. Sorry about that.
They can tell me their answers to that afterwards. Thank you. Can we thank the speakers, please, and thank you all for your questions.